Hey there, my name is Gary Sims and this is Gary Explains. Now, one of the big debates that's been in computing over the last few decades is CISC versus RISC, and I have a video about that here on this channel. And in the past I've compared, for example, ARM, which is RISC, to x86. I've compared to RISC-V to x86. And in this video I want to look at RISC versus RISC, as in RISC-V versus ARM. What are the differences between these two architectures? Well, if you want to find out more, please let me explain. Before we get started, I just want to point out that because I have covered some of the history of ARM and some of the stuff about RISC-V in two previous videos, that I will leave a timecode down in the description if you want to jump over some of these bits. However, I have been updating the slides as I've been doing those other videos with stuff that I think is also important. So let's get cracking straight away. What can we find out here? Quick history of ARM. Acorn Computers was a British computer company established in Cambridge, and ARM still is in Cambridge today, in 1978. And it was most famous for building the BBC Micro, which was a really important micro for the home computer revolution that happened in the UK during the 80s. Elite, which is a classic, absolute classic game, was written and developed by David Braben and Ian Bell on the BBC Micro, and it was originally published by Acorn Soft, so it's Acorn Computers, Acorn Soft for the BBC Micro. Then of course it was ported to so many others, and of course you've got modern versions of Elite today, Elite Frontiers. Now, in 1983, Acorn started its Acorn RISC Machine ARM project, and resulting in a reduced instruction set RISC processor that would eventually be known as the 32-bit ARM1. Now, to keep costs low, the ARM1 used plastic packaging, so the design had to be under 1 watt. And the prototype chip was made in 1985. And when they tested it, this is the story that is told at the time by the people involved, the first test board had a fault on it, and the chip was actually only powered via leakage, so it wasn't even connected properly to the power supply. And so though it was designed to run at 1 watt, the chip actually averaged only 100 milliwatts, because even through this leakage it was still actually being powered up. So they'd worked out, found out this way to build a very power efficient chip. And then of course from then onwards you've then got the progression of the different chips. ARM2 came out in 1987, and the first consumer computer based on an ARM chip, so we're talking about Apple Macs today with the M1. Way back in 1987 you had the Acorn Archimedes, which had an ARM processor in it, and that was a desktop PC. Now, by the time we get to 1986, Apple began using ARM processors for its R&D, and eventually it came up with the first tablet that Apple did, and it was called the Newton, an amazing machine at its time. However, didn't succeed, so that project died. But the use of that ARM processor was revolutionary at the time, and so advanced RISC machines, rather than Acorn RISC machines, ARM is spun off from Acorn in 1991 with investment from Apple. And of course this is 1991, and here we are all these years later, and of course Apple's still very much a big user of ARM processors. Now at this point it became an IP company, intellectual property, so rather than selling actual physical chips or making physical chips, it sold the design of those to other companies who could then put them in their chips. Now by 2002 ARM's partners had shipped over 1 billion ARM-based chips. That number reached 50 billion by 2014, and now in 2021 an average of 6 billion chips are shipped every quarter, so that's absolutely amazing. And of course ARM chips today are found in smartphones, both in Android and iOS, tablets, laptops, and of course servers, so basically everywhere. Now a few things that I've added in here compared to previous videos is because I want to just talk about these, because we will be comparing the ARM ISA to the RISC-V ISA. So first of all, we have to point out that ARM's ISA is mature and advanced. Okay, RISC-V started kind of in 2010, whereas of course here we were talking about things that started way back in the 1980s and onwards. And so that by now the ARM ISA is very mature, very stable and advanced. So we're talking about things like cryptography extensions, memory tagging extensions, modern things to do with security and making sure that the malware can't run and access different parts of the memory that it shouldn't do. And the result of that in this process of maturing the architecture. We're now up to the V9 architecture, so version 9 of the architecture. And the Cortex-A510, the A710, the X2, the Neoverse N2 are all V9 processors. So it's not V9, it's not some sort of vaporware. It's here today in actual processors. And some of the big things that we find in V9 are Scalable Vector Extensions version 2. Now, ARM originally partnered with Fujitsu to create the Scalable Vector Extensions. It's at the heart of the world's fastest supercomputer. And now SVE2, a development of that, enables better ML and adds DSP-like capabilities. Now, the point is here is that the vector extensions are variable, which means if you can write the software once. It doesn't matter how those vector extensions are implemented in the hardware, whether it's 64-bit wide or 128-bit wide or 256-bit wide, the same software will work. That's the key thing about the scalable vector extensions. And the other big thing is we've got the ARM Confidential Compute Architecture, CCA, which in practical terms, we're talking about a thing called realms, which basically allows you to run mini little hypervisors inside of the chip so that your banking app can't get access by anybody other part of the operating system or any other apps. It's its own private hardware protected memory, and it's obviously way more complex than that in the sense that it can do much more, but that's basically where we're getting at. And because of that, it's also useful not only in smartphones but also in cloud computing, because now we're coming to an era where you can actually guarantee that whatever service that you're running on your cloud computer is isolated completely from all the other services running on that cloud computer. Of course, cloud computers run lots and lots of things. That's the whole point of them, that they're running so many different tasks, but now you can actually have them isolated. So that's a really interesting thing that we're going to look forward to in the next few years. Now, a couple of other things worth mentioning is, first of all, is for Cortex-A processors, 32 bits is dead, and that basically means the processors we find in Android smartphones. So from 2023, all ARM Cortex-A cores will be 64-bit only. In fact, iPhone processors have already gone to 64-bit only, so that's ARM-compatible processors designed by Apple have already gone 64 bits only. And I have a whole video called 32 bits is dead, where I look at what that means in the history and what it means in terms of compatibility, if you're interested in finding out more. But it's important, this is for Cortex-A processors. And why I say that is because ARM actually makes 4 types of processors. Cortex-A for smartphones, tablets, laptops, and so on. But it also has, of course, a very powerful microcontroller range in the Cortex-M range. Okay, and these still remain at 32 bits. And the Cortex-M0 Plus, which is the smallest microcontroller they do, is just 12,000 gates. Full 32-bit processor, 12,000 gates, 0.04 millimeters squared. So a very, very tiny microprocessor you can get on there. It also has Cortex-R processors, which are for real-time applications. And then there are the Neoverse processors, which are for servers. So you've got the Neoverse N1, the N2, and the V1. So let's do the same thing for RISC-V. So the original RISC-1 processor was the result of some research done by David Patterson, a very important person in the RISC and RISC-V community. He wrote the original paper on RISC while he was at the University of California, Berkeley, and that is, he coined the term RISC, idea, simple instructions, fixed length opcodes, load store architecture. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Released in 1981, had 44,000 transistors and implemented 31 instructions. That was followed then by the RISC-II processor in 1983, and that had a condensed 16-bit instructions, so you could get more instructions in a certain space of memory. And then there is the RISC-IV and the RISC-V processors. Don't get talked about much, but basically they were designed by students who were in under Patterson's supervision, 1984, 1988. One was optimized to run Smalltalk, the other was optimized to run Lisp. So we've got RISC-I, RISC-II, RISC-III, and RISC-IV, which is then why we then get into RISC-V. So the work on RISC-V started in 2010, again at the University of California. It's an open ISA. Okay, that means that the architecture is free to use by anybody. You don't need a specific license or to pay any royalties. However, it's not open source hardware. This is a big thing that people don't understand, and I will go into that a bit more in a moment. There are 2 versions, 32-bit and 64-bit versions, and 128 is possible according to the architecture documentation. every RISC-V processor has to implement the base integer ISA, okay, and if it's a 32-bit one, it becomes RV, RISC-V 32 I for integer, or RISC-V 64-bit. Now that base integer doesn't even have multiply and divide commands in it, so it's a very, very simple base ISA that needs to be installed, and then there are extensions for adding on other things, including multiply and divide. Now RISC-V is made by commercial and non-commercial organizations. So for example, there are universities that are designing RISC-V processors, they're publishing their work, they're using it as a tool to teach their students about how to design processors. And there are also commercial entities, for example Sci-Fi, which has been in the news recently with the possible approach by Intel to buy it, and that's a commercial operation, and its licensing model is similar to ARM's in the sense that if you want to use their RISC-V processor core, then you pay a licensing fee, whether that's a royalty or whatever it is, the business deal they have, but it's a commercial organization that charges money for the designs of the RISC-V processors that it creates. Now we talked about those extensions. So for example, if you wanted multiplication and division, you have to implement the M extension. If you want atomic instructions, you have to implement the A extension. Then there's also single, double and quad precision floating point, F, D and Q. And there's also an extension for using compressed instructions. So again, being able to squeeze more instructions into a certain amount of memory. Now it could get quite boring because most processors will probably implement integer multiplication and division. Most will probably implement some form of floating point operation. So G is a short form for MAFD. So if you have a RISC-V 64 GC, that means the G means it's got M, A, F and D, so it's got multiply and it's got the floating point, and C means it's also got the extension for compressed instructions. And there are other non-ratified extensions like B for bit manipulation, P for packed SMDs, V for vector operations and so on, and these will be ratified probably over time. At the moment they become a proposal, and then if someone wants to implement them, they are of course free to do that. Now, talking again about this thing about open ISA and not open source hardware, this is directly from the RISC-V FAQ. If a company builds a RISC-V implementation, is it required to release the source code for that core? No. The source code can be completely closed. And this is because, of course, it's just the fact that you can build a processor that follows that instruction set. That when it sees those ones and zeros, what do those ones and zeros mean? That's what RISC-V gives you. It doesn't give you free CPUs. It doesn't give you free chips. And it's not like the Linux revolution, but for hardware, it's completely different. And one of the reasons is this isn't software. With software, you just need to be a person with a compiler and an internet connection, and you can start contributing to open source software. It's not hard. But building chips, of course, is a multi-million-dollar business. So, you know, if you want a chip run, you don't just ring up and say, oh, please send me 3 chips. You have to, you know, it's a huge, complicated business. So there's nowhere the same dynamic as open source software. Not only that, of course, is the RISC-V ISA needs to be stable. It's not meant to be changing every 5 seconds with this patch and that patch and this patch and that patch. It actually wants to be something pretty stable. Now, the chips that are designed, well, whoever designs them, that's up to them what they do, but trying to do collaborative chip design has not been something that has really been done really before, unlike collaborative software, which is done very successfully. Now, of course, you have FPGAs. They do help, but they're not going to help when you're trying to make a competitor to the latest Snapdragon processor or the latest, you know, the Apple M1 processor in RISC-V. That's not going to help. That's a very complicated, advanced, technical thing that you're trying to do. So this is not a Linux-like revolution for hardware, and I wish people would stop saying that. So let's get on to the differences. So first of all, ARM is a company and an architecture. Okay, so when people say it's using the ARM architecture, like the Apple processors use the ARM architecture, that supercomputer from Fujitsu uses the ARM architecture, but ARM is also a company that designs processors, that designs CPU cores that are compliant with its own architecture. So it is a company and an architecture, whereas RISC-V is just an architecture governed by an organization, RISC-V International, so they govern the architecture, but they're not in the business of designing chips themselves. They're in the business of maintaining and overseeing the architecture. So ARM designs CPUs and, of course, GPU cores and NPU cores and other things, and then licenses them to other companies like Qualcomm, Samsung, MediaTek, or whoever. And on the RISC-V side, you've got companies like Sci-Fi, Andes Technology. They also design RISC-V cores, and they license them to others. So in that sense, ARM and Sci-Fi and Andy's Technology and other companies, they're all doing the same thing. They're designing a CPU core and they're licensing that design to other people, and you pay for that design. Now, some companies have an ARM architectural license, meaning they can design clean room ARM compatible processors. That's what Apple has, that's what Nvidia has, that's what Fujitsu has, and many others. Samsung has one. Okay, and so they allow them to design, but they have to be completely compatible with the ARM architecture. There are tests that they need to run to make sure they remain compatible. Okay, and so there is the ability for other companies to design ARM processors, and they are licensed to do that. Now, some companies design their own RISC-V processors, like Western Digital. They designed it to go inside of their hard disk controllers. Nvidia do to go inside their GPU because they wanted a microcontroller that was able to do some things. Now, they can design those, but there's no license fee involved. So that's the fundamental difference. When it comes to doing your own architectural stuff, companies like Apple and Nvidia and Fujitsu can do that, but there's a business agreement. For RISC-V, you don't need that business agreement. But as I pointed out to somebody just recently in the comments, it doesn't seem to hurt Apple's profits at all, or Nvidia's, by the fact that they have to have this relationship. Because when you have a relationship, when you have a business relationship, a contract, a license, then there is a mutual respect and a mutual back and forth technical support, and also input into other things that are happening in the architecture, and so much more, because you're now in a business relationship. When something is free, there is no business relationship, it's just free. So we have to talk about performance. Where are we in terms of performance for RISC-V CPUs and for ARM CPUs? Of course, Sci-Fi has just recently announced the P550. It's P for Performance Core, and it claims to be comparable with the Cortex A75. So that's where Sci-Fi are at, and probably Sci-Fi are making some of the most advanced RISC-V processors back today. So where are they? Cortex A75 era. Well, after the Cortex A75 came the Cortex A76, the Cortex A77, the Cortex A78, the Cortex A710, and then of course we also have the X1 and the X2. So you can see that makes the P550 at least 4 or 5 generations behind what ARM is producing today. And to catch up, companies like Sci-Fi and other RISC-V manufacturers need to make cores that not only increase their own performance, they need to gain on the performance that ARM are releasing each year. So now they're 4 years behind, then they need to be 3 years behind, then they need to be... So that's a significant leap year after year after year to not only do better themselves, but to gain on the competition. So that's quite a tall order for anybody in any field of technology. And just let me give you an example of a real world application. The upcoming Beagle 5 is a Beagle board, but using a RISC-V processor. It has a 1 GHz dual core U75 from Sci-Fi. It will cost between $120 and $150. Now the U74 is equivalent to the Cortex A55 in terms of performance, whereas the Raspberry Pi runs at 1.5 GHz, a quad core, Cortex A72, faster than the A55, and it costs $75. So you can see here there is a real world disparity between pricing and performance between what you can get today using an ARM processor and what you can get using a RISC-V processor. Even though RISC-V is free, I thought free meant it was going to bring in all the heady days of great. No, someone's got to design it, someone's got to pay the engineers, someone's got to have the vision, someone's got to have the tech, costs money. Worth talking also about OS support. Linux works on both 32-bit and 64-bit ARM and RISC-V CPUs, and so that's a very well established set of support there. Android doesn't officially support RISC-V, Windows doesn't run on RISC-V, Mac OS doesn't run on RISC-V, Chrome OS doesn't run on RISC-V, but Android, Windows, Mac OS and Chrome OS all run on ARM processors. Android, of course, runs on ARM. Windows, we have Windows for Snapdragon now. See my review of the Surface Pro X here on this channel. Mac OS, of course, with the M1 processor, runs on ARM, and of course there are many Chromebooks with ARM processors. And it's also worth mentioning that because RISC-V allows these extensions, then there is nothing to stop companies adding their own extensions, and if it's a big enough company, then if you don't have that extension, you become irrelevant. And of course, there's a whole big history about what happened with MMX and 3D now and all that kind of stuff way back in the history of Intel and AMD. So Andy's technology has the Andy's extended instructions, which are, in quotes, exclusive performance and functionality enhancements, and they've added that to their processors, and they're not in anyone else's processors. So you can see there is this danger of RISC-V breaking up into many different paths depending on which extensions you've used. But in comparison, all ARM chips are compliant to the ISA, even the ones from Apple, from Samsung, from NVIDIA, and they have to pass tests to make sure they are completely doing that, and that stops any danger of any kind of forking down the road. A company says, no, we've added this functionality, and you know, and we're not going to do what you want. It doesn't happen. It's all compliant. And in fact, companies like Apple and NVIDIA, all the major partners, have had their input into ARM v9 because, of course, they're going to be using it. So it makes sense to have them on board for anything that happens with the architecture. So what about the future? Well, a big name will likely get into RISC-V at some point. We're hearing that Intel wants to do that, but it means to getting into it beyond their proprietary needs. So a lot of fanfare has been made when NVIDIA or Western Digital use RISC-V, but of course they're just doing it for their own internal use. NVIDIA uses a RISC-V in its GPU because it needed a microcontroller, and RISC-V was just as much a good idea as any other, but they don't sell that microcontroller to anybody else. So it's only when a big name gets involved in RISC-V and it's then selling that beyond, you know, as a processor or selling the IP or something like that, will win. It will be interesting, and that's why Intel sniffing around to buy Sci-5 could be interesting. And RISC-V will continue to grow in the microcontroller market, there's no doubt about that, but we're still waiting for a popular, prevalent RISC-V Arduino alternative, and that does not yet exist. And as I said, the Beagle 5 won't rival the Pi in terms of cost or in terms of performance. However, Linux-capable RISC-V CPUs will continue to be made, and they will continue to make progress like the recent announcements, but they are still a long way behind what ARM are offering today. On the ARM side, ARM processors will continue to push their way into laptops and desktops with the help of Apple and Qualcomm and Microsoft and Google. These will the areas where we're seeing ARM processors will continue to expand, and of course that's also true in the server space with the Neoverse processors. And ARM v9 is setting the scene for the next decade of ARM processors, so a big announcement in terms of what it can do and what they're going to do. Big emphasis on security, stop this malware stealing things from one memory to another bit of memory because it shouldn't have access to it. All of the Spectre and Meltdown things that we've seen, and all the runs that followed after, there's been quite a few of them trying to get around that in a hardware level. And the only other question that remains is, will there be a knock-on effect if NVIDIA completes its purchase of ARM? Will NVIDIA abandon RISC-V for its microcontroller, for example? What's going to happen there? And of course, that's an unknown at the moment, but I do have a video about NVIDIA buying ARM if you'd want some more information about that. My name is Gary Sims. This is Gary Explains. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.